The great hall of the Galactic Coalition Military Academy stretched upward like the inside of a cathedral, and its walls glowed with the names of 10,000 heroes carved in light. Cadet Elara Vance stood at the back of the crowd and tried to make herself small, which was easy because she was already the smallest person in the room by a significant margin. Around her stood the children of empires. The Kivathi cadets towered above everyone else, their scaled bodies gleaming like polished armor, and their golden eyes tracked every movement in the hall with predatory focus. The Shen clustered together in a group of shifting crystal, their bodies catching the light and throwing rainbows across the walls whenever they moved. The massive Torvans stood like living mountains, each one easily 3 meters tall and built from what appeared to be solid muscle and bone-thick hide. And then there was Elara. She was 5 feet 6 inches of pale skin and brown hair and soft human tissue, and every alien in the room knew exactly how fragile she was. Humanity had joined the Galactic Coalition only 15 years ago, and in that time they had proven themselves to be clever traders and decent diplomats and absolutely nothing special in any military capacity. The other species had spent millions of years evolving natural weapons. The Kivathi had venomous claws and skin that could stop bullets. The Shen could vibrate their crystalline bodies at frequencies that shattered metal. The Torvan could simply walk through walls if the walls annoyed them enough. Humans had none of these things. Humans had soft skin and dull teeth and fingernails that broke if you looked at them wrong. The only reason Elara had been admitted to the academy was politics, and everyone knew it. The coalition wanted to seem inclusive, and humanity had begged for a seat at the table. And so here she was, the token human, the political gesture, the proof that the coalition welcomed all species, even the pathetic ones. Weapons Master Vertesh strode to the center of the hall, and the crowd fell silent. He was Kivathi, ancient and scarred, with one eye missing and one arm ending in a prosthetic that looked more like a weapon than a limb. He had killed more enemies than most cadets had met people, and he made no secret of his contempt for the human admission. "Today you become warriors," he announced, his voice filling the hall without any need for amplification. "Today you bond with your weapons, the tools that will define your service to the coalition." He gestured and servitors floated forward, carrying racks of gleaming equipment. Kivathi cadets stepped forward. The scaled warriors approached and received plasma lances, elegant weapons that hummed with contained fire and could cut through starship armor at 50 meters. Shen cadets, the crystal beings, accepted harmonic disruptors, devices that amplified their natural frequencies into devastating sonic attacks. Torvan cadets, the giants, claimed graviton hammers, massive weapons that bent gravity itself and could crush a tank with a single swing. One by one the species approached and received their designated weapons, each tool perfectly matched to their biology and fighting style. The servitors began to empty. Elara watched her fellow cadets admire their new weapons and felt her stomach tighten. Finally, Vertesh turned to her, and his remaining eye glittered with something that might have been amusement or might have been malice. "Ah, yes," he said, and his voice carried perfectly through the suddenly quiet hall. "The human." He reached into a container that Elara had not noticed before and pulled out something that made the entire assembly erupt in sounds of mockery. It was a wooden stick, about 5 feet long, made of simple terrenochid. Was the kind of thing given to children on 100 worlds. A training tool for those too young or too weak for real weapons. Humans are too fragile for plasma weapons, Vertesh announced to the crowd. Their nervous systems cannot handle harmonic frequencies, and their bodies would shatter under graviton feedback. He tossed the stick toward Elara with casual contempt. "This is appropriate for your kind." The hall filled with noise. The Kivathi hissed their laughter. The Shen chimed in. Crystalline mockery. Even the stoic Torvan rumbled with amusement. Alara caught the stick. It was heavier than she expected, dense and solid. The wood once smooth by handling, she recognized it from the cultural package humanity had sent with their diplomatic mission, a traditional weapon from Earth's history. Included as a curiosity rather than a serious contribution, Vorth watched her with obvious satisfaction, waiting for tears or protests or the pleading that he clearly expected. Instead, Alara examined the staff carefully. She tested its weight and balance. She ran her fingers along the grain of the wood, and then she did something that made Vortesh's satisfaction flicker into confusion. She bowed. It was a proper bow, the kind her grandmother had taught her, deep and respectful and completely sincere. "Thank you, Weapons Master," she said, and her voice did not waver. "I am honored to receive a weapon of my people." She straightened and met his eye without flinching. "I will train with it every day." Vortesh stared at her for a long moment. He had expected weeping. He had expected complaints to the commandant. He had expected the human to break. Instead, she simply turned and walked back to her position at the edge of the crowd, the wooden staff held carefully in her hands. The other cadets quickly lost interest. The human with a stick was not worth their attention. They had real weapons to admire and real training to anticipate. Elar stood alone at the back of the hall and watched them all. She studied the way the Kavathi held their plasma lances and noticed how they kept their claws well away from the firing mechanism. She observed the Shen and their disruptors and saw how carefully they monitored the frequency displays. She watched the Torvan struggle to adjust the graviton settings on their hammers and heard them ask each other for help with the controls. They did not understand their weapons. She realized they had never needed to. Their weapons were designed by engineers and calibrated by technicians and handed to soldiers who simply pointed them at enemies and pressed buttons. Alara looked down at the wooden staff in her hands. There were no buttons. There were no calibrations. There was only the wood. And the warrior who wielded it, her grandmother, had taught her to fight with sticks when she was 7 years old. Humans have been fighting with sticks for longer than most species have existed. The old woman had said, "We had to, because we did not have claws or venom or armor. So we found sticks and stones and we made them into weapons. And we became very, very good at using them." Alara had not understood then why her grandmother considered that important. Now she was beginning to understand. She gripped the staff and walked out of the great hall while the other cadets celebrated their shining new weapons. She had a lot of training to do. The months passed slowly for most cadets at the academy, but for Alara, they vanished like water through open fingers. She woke every morning 2 hours before dawn and trained in the empty combat halls while the rest of the academy slept. She practiced the forms her grandmother had taught her, the sweeping arcs of Filipino arnis, the precise thrusts of Japanese bujutsu, the flowing movements of Chinese gun technique. She trained until her arms burned and her hands blistered and her legs threatened to collapse beneath her, and then she went to breakfast and pretended she had not been awake for hours. The other cadets had stopped noticing her almost immediately after the weapon ceremony. She was not worth bullying because bullying required acknowledgement, and acknowledging the human meant admitting she existed. It also, Alara became invisible, a ghost that drifted through classes and meals and training exercises without leaving any impression. This suited her perfectly. Invisible people could watch without being watched in return, and Alara watched everything. She watched the Kivati cadets struggle with overheating plasma lances during extended combat drills. She watched the Shen accidentally shatter their own disruptors when their emotional frequencies Spiked too high, she watched the Torvan curse and fumble with graviton hammer calibrations that required a precision their massive fingers could not easily provide. Every species had designed their weapons to compensate for their natural weaknesses, and every species had created new weaknesses in the process. The Kivathi were cold-blooded and needed external heat, so their plasma lances generated warmth as a byproduct. But this meant the weapons could overheat catastrophically if fired too rapidly. The Shen were emotionally volatile, and their crystal bodies resonated with their feelings, so their disruptors had limiters to prevent feedback. But this meant a strong enough shock could shatter the weapons entirely. The Torvan had incredible strength but limited dexterity, so their graviton hammers had simplified controls. But this meant that the weapons could be disabled by targeting a single small component. Alara memorized every weakness she observed and filed them away in her mind like tools in a workshop. One night, 3 months after her arrival, she discovered she was not as invisible as she believed. "Cadet Vance," said a voice from the darkness of the empty training hall, "your technique requires adjustment." Alara spun with her staff raised and found herself facing a holographic projection of the Academy's combat. AI axis appeared as a geometric shape of shifting light, something between a crystal and a flame, and its voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Your left foot placement is 7 degrees off optimal," Axis continued. "This reduces the power of your forward thrust by approximately 12%. Alara stared at the AI for a long moment before lowering her staff. "I did not know anyone was watching," she said carefully. "I watch all cadets." Axis replied, "I am programmed to assist in combat training. Though I confess I have never been asked to analyze wooden staff techniques before." The AI paused, and something in its light patterns shifted in a way that might have been curiosity. "Your weapon is not in my database," Axis said. "I have spent the past 3 months researching human martial traditions, and I find myself confused." "Confused about what?" "Humans have spent over 10,000 years developing combat techniques for wooden sticks," the AI said. "This is longer than most species have possessed fire, and yet I cannot understand why, as surely any species that developed spaceflight would have abandoned such primitive weapons long ago." Alara smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had allowed herself since arriving at the Academy. "We kept the old ways because they worked," she said. "Guns jam and batteries die, and technology fails, but a stick is always a stick. And a warrior who can fight with a stick can fight with anything." Axis processed this for several seconds. "I have cross-referenced your statement with human military history," the AI finally said. "I find evidence supporting your claim, as human soldiers have frequently been recorded using improvised melee weapons even when advanced firearms were available. An analysis suggests this is not desperation, but rather tactical preference in certain situations." The geometric shape flickered and shifted. "I would like to assist your training." "Cadet Vance," Alara narrowed her eyes. "Why would you help me specifically?" "Because you are the only cadet in this academy who actually wants to understand combat," Axis said. "The others want to use their weapons, but you want to understand fighting itself. And this distinction interests me greatly." From that night forward, AXIS became her teacher. The AI fed her movement algorithms calibrated to human reaction time, and proprioception it showed her holographic models of every weapon in the Academy arsenal and highlighted their mechanical weaknesses. It ran simulations of combat scenarios and taught her to predict enemy movements by reading body language and weapon behaviors. Most importantly, it helped her understand something that changed everything. Plasma bolts follow predictable electromagnetic curves, Axis explained one night as they studied holographic weapon schematics together. "The curve is determined by the lance's barrel alignment, the charge level, and the ambient electromagnetic field. So if I knew all three variables, I could predict exactly where a bolt would go. Elara said slowly. Theoretically, yes. Though the calculation would need to be performed in approximately 40 milliseconds to allow time for physical reaction. That is faster than human reaction time. Correct. Axis agreed. Which is why I suggest you stop trying to react. Elara frowned in confusion. If you cannot react fast enough to dodge, the AI explained, then you must predict instead of react. And if you study Kivathi combat techniques, you will notice they have tells, specific eye movements before firing, muscle tensions in their arms, and a characteristic whine from the lance's charging cycle that occurs exactly 200 milliseconds before discharge. You want me to learn to read the shooter instead of watching the shot. I want you to understand that the weapon is not your enemy, Axis said. And its light patterns pulsed with something that might have been satisfaction. The warrior holding the weapon is your enemy. And warriors are always predictable if you study them long enough. Elara began watching the Kivathi cadets with new eyes. She memorized their stances and their habits and their tiny unconscious movements. She learned to recognize the moment before they fired. The instant of decision that preceded the action. She practiced her responses until they became automatic, until her body moved before her conscious mind could interfere. The other cadets continued to ignore her. They polished their plasma lances and calibrated their disruptors and admired their graviton hammers. They never once considered that the invisible human with the wooden stick was watching them. They never imagined that she was preparing 6 months after the FUD weapon ceremony. A Shen cadet named Shira approached Elara in the mess hall. Human, Shira said, her crystalline voice chiming with condescension. I have a question for you. Elara looked up from her meal and said nothing. Tomorrow we begin the crucible. Shira continued. The survival assessment on the jungle moon, and my team has been assigned a human. Which is to say my team has been assigned dead weight. What is your question? Shira leaned closer, and her crystal body rang with irritation. Try not to die too quickly, the Shen said. I would prefer to not waste resources protecting you. She turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Elara watched her go and then returned to her meal. Tomorrow she would show them what dead weight could do. The jungle moon of Ketharis hung in the void like a green and brown marble, and its atmosphere screamed against the hull of the drop shuttle as they descended through layers of toxic cloud. Elara gripped her wooden staff and watched her teammates check their weapons for the 15th time. Keth, the Kivathi, sat across from her and polished his plasma lance with obsessive attention, his golden eyes never once glancing in her direction. Shira the Shen hummed to herself as she calibrated her harmonic disruptor, her crystal body throwing nervous rainbows across the shuttle interior. Grun. The Torvan simply sat in silence and let his graviton hammer rest across his massive knees, his expression as unreadable as stone. The fifth member of their team was an insectoid named Vex, a member of a species Elara did not recognize. All black chitin and clicking mandibles and compound eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Vex had not spoken to her either. But unlike the others, there was no contempt in the insectoid's silence, only a patient watchfulness that Elara found almost comforting. Listen carefully, Keth announced as the shuttle shuddered through another layer of atmosphere. I am team leader, and I have a plan for survival. He gestured at the holographic map projected in the center of the shuttle. We land here, move north to the extraction point, and eliminate any threats along the way, he said. Brun takes point because nothing can hurt him. I provide range support. Shira handles any enemies that get too close. And Vex scouts ahead. What about the human? Shira asked with a chiming laugh. Keth finally looked at Elara, and his expression was a mixture of annoyance and pity. Stay behind us and try not to die, he said. If we are attacked, you hide and let the real warriors handle it." "Understood." Ilara nodded once and said nothing. The shuttle hit the jungle canopy with a crash of breaking branches and came to rest in a small clearing surrounded by trees that stretched hundreds of meters into the green-tinged sky. They emerged into air that was thick with moisture and strange sounds. Alien creatures calling to each other in the distance. Insects buzzing past with wings that glittered like metal. "Move out," Keth ordered. They traveled for 6 hours through terrain that seemed designed to kill them, vines with thorns like knives hung across every path, pools of liquid that might have been water or might have been acid blocked their way at random intervals. Creatures watched them from the shadows. Things with too many eyes and too many teeth. Though nothing attacked during daylight, Ilara moved quietly at the rear of the group and watched her teammates struggle. Keth kept his plasma lance raised constantly, which meant his arms were trembling with exhaustion. By the third Aosher's crystal body collected moisture from the humid air, and the water interfered with her disruptor's frequency modulation. Grun's massive weight meant he sank into soft ground constantly, and his graviton hammer was too large to swing effectively in the dense vegetation. Only Vex seemed comfortable, the insectoid's multiple legs carrying it across any terrain with ease, and Ilara, with her simple wooden staff and her soft human body, found that the jungle did not hate her any more than it hated anyone else. They made camp as darkness fell, and the jungle came alive with sounds that made sleep impossible. "I will take first watch," Keth announced. "Everyone else rest. We move at dawn." Ilara did not rest. She lay in the darkness with her eyes open and listened to the jungle and waited. The attack came 2 hours before dawn. Ilara heard them first. A faint whine of servomotors, the click of metal legs on wood, the hum of charging weapons. "Contact," she shouted as she rolled to her feet. The jungle exploded with light. Academy combat drones dropped from the canopy like metal spiders, their chassis bristling with weapons, their optical sensors glowing red in the darkness. These were training drones, designed to test cadets with escalating lethality, and they had clearly been programmed to hit hard and fast. Keth fired his plasma lance and caught a drone's center mass, and the machine exploded in a shower of sparks and molten metal. 2 more took its place. Shira activated her disruptor and sent a wave of sonic force through the clearing, and drones staggered and stumbled, but they did not fall. Grun swung his graviton hammer and crushed a drone flat, but the effort left him open, and 2 more latched onto his back. Vex moved like a liquid shadow, too fast for the drones to track. But the insectoid's natural weapons could not penetrate their armor, and still the drones kept coming. "My lance is overheating," Keth shouted as warning lights flickered across his weapon. "I need to let it cool. My disruptor is cracking," Shira cried, her voice chiming with panic. "The humidity damaged the casing. Hammer is dry," Grun rumbled. Graviton cells depleted. In seconds, the most advanced weapons in the galaxy had become useless, and the drones closed in for the kill. Ilara stepped forward. She moved without thinking, letting the thousands of hours of training take control. Her staff swept low and caught a drone's forward legs, and the machine stumbled just as she knew it would, because she had studied the Academy drone schematics with the XIS for weeks. She spun and drove the tip of her staff into the sensor cluster on another drone's head, and the machine went blind and began firing wildly at nothing. A third drone lunged at her with cutting appendages extended, and she sidestepped and struck the power conduit that ran along its spine, and the machine collapsed as its systems lost connection. She was everywhere at once. She was nowhere. The drones expected she did not fight with strength because humans did not have strength. She fought with precision and speed and an intimate knowledge of exactly where to hit to make something stop. Working, the oak staff found joint servos and cracked them. It struck sensor clusters and shattered them. It drove into power housings and severed them. Ilara moved through The drones like water through stones. And everywhere she passed, machines fell. The last drone tried to retreat, its damaged legs struggling to carry it back into the jungle. And Alara caught it with a sweeping strike that sent it tumbling into a pool of what was definitely acid silence. Fell over the clearing. Alara stood in the center of a ring of destroyed machines, her staff raised, her breathing hard but controlled her. 4 teammates stared at Herkith's mouth hung open and his overheated lance dangled forgotten at his side. Shira's crystal body had gone completely still, her usual chiming silenced by shock. Grun simply blinked, his small eyes again and again as if he could not process what he had seen. Vex clicked softly and moved closer to examine the drone wreckage. "You knew where to hit them," the insectoid said. And it was not a question. Alara lowered her staff and took a deep breath. "Everything has weak points," she said quietly. "Everything." She looked at her teammates, at their useless weapons, at their expressions of dawning realization. "Your plasma lance overheats because the cooling system cannot keep pace with rapid fire," she told Kath. "You need to fire in controlled bursts of 3 or fewer shots." She turned to Shira. "Your disruptor cracks because humidity interferes with the crystal resonance. So you need to keep it wrapped in thermal fabric when not in use." She looked at Grun. "Your graviton cells deplete quickly because you are using maximum force for every swing. But most targets only require 30% power to destroy." The 3 cadets stared at her in stunned silence. Vex made a sound that might have been laughter. "The human knows more about your weapons than you do," the insectoid observed. Alara picked up a piece of drone wreckage and examined it in the growing light of dawn. "I know more about everything," she said simply, "because I had to. Because nobody expected me to survive, so I made sure I would survive anyway." She tossed the wreckage aside and gripped her staff. "Now let us get to the extraction point before more drones find us." She started walking north without waiting to see if they would follow. After a moment they did. Word spread through the academy like fire. Through dry grass, the human with the wooden stick had destroyed 12 combat drones in under 2 minutes. The human had saved her entire team when they're advanced. Weapons failed. The human had known exactly where to worry. Strike to disable machines that were designed to survive plasma, fire and sonic assault and graviton. Impact cadets who had ignored Alara for 6 months suddenly found reasons to watch her. Trained, they gathered at the edges of the combat halls and whispered to each other as she moved through her forms, the wooden staff spinning and striking and sweeping through patterns that looked almost like dancing. Some watched with new respect in their eyes, others watched with growing unease, and one watched with pure hatred. Weapons Master Vertesh had built his reputation on the certainty that humans did not belong in the coalition military. He had given the human a wooden stick specifically to humiliate her and drive her to quit. He had expected tears and failure and the satisfaction of being proven right. Instead, he had reports from 4 cadets describing the human as the only reason they survived the crucible. This was unacceptable. "I am calling for an official inquiry," Vertesh announced at the next senior staff meeting. The human clearly cheated during the survival assessment, possibly by sabotaging her teammates' weapons. Commandant Sereth, an ancient being whose species Alara had never been able to identify, regarded the weapons master with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. "You have evidence of this sabotage?" Sereth asked. And the question was asked without any hint of accusation. "The evidence is obvious," Vertesh replied. "No human could disable 12 combat drones with a stick unless they had arranged for the outcome in advance." "I see." Sereth was quiet for a long moment. "There will be no inquiry," the commandant finally said. "But if you wish to test the human's abilities under controlled conditions, I will permit a formal challenge. Vertesh's remaining eye gleamed. A duel, he said. Single combat, witnessed by the Academy. Between the human and a proper warrior. Choose the challenger, Sereth replied. And I will make the arrangements. The announcement came the next morning. Cadet Alara Vance of Earth would face Cadet Keth of Kavath in formal single combat. The duel would be held in the ceremonial arena and broadcast to coalition military officials across the galaxy. Plasma Lance versus Wooden Stick. The entire academy gathered in the arena. Thousands of cadets and instructors, filling the tiered seating that surrounded the circular combat floor. Holographic projections carried the event to watching officials on 100 worlds, including Earth, where humanity's ambassador sat pale and worried in a viewing chamber. Alara walked onto the arena floor and felt the weight of every eye upon her. She wore simple training clothes and carried her oak staff. And beside the gleaming armor of her opponent, she looked small and fragile and hopelessly outmatched. Keth stood across from her in full Kivathi battle dress, his scales polished until they shone like gold, his plasma lance humming with barely contained power. He did not look at her with hatred. He looked at her with something closer to pity. Human, he said quietly so only she could hear. I do not wish to harm you, so if you yield now, I will ask Vertesh to end this farce. Alara met his golden eyes and smiled. You saved my life in the crucible, she replied just as quietly. But I need you to understand something. Keth. What? I was never in danger. The ceremonial horn sounded before he could respond. And Keth raised his lance and fell into a combat stance that Alara had watched him practice 1,000 times. She knew exactly what he was going to do. His first shot would come high, aimed at her left shoulder, because Kivathi always tested their opponents with a non-lethal opening strike. Alara shifted her weight onto her back foot and waited. Keth fired. The plasma bolt screamed across the arena in a streak of blue-white fire. And Alara moved her staff swept up in an arc that AXIS had helped her calculate, striking the bolt at precisely the angle needed to redirect its electromagnetic curve. And the plasma screamed past her ear and splashed against the arena wall in a shower of sparks. The crowd went silent. Keth stared at her with his mouth hanging open. That is impossible. He breathed. No, Alara said. Just very difficult. He fired again, faster this time. Aiming for center mass, she deflected again, her staff meeting the bolt with the same precise angle. And again the plasma veered away harmlessly. The crowd began to murmur. Keth's eyes narrowed, and his stance shifted. And Alara recognized the change immediately. He was abandoning precision for speed, planning to overwhelm her with rapid fire. His lance began to whine as he charged it for sustained assault. But Alara was not watching the lance. She was watching his eyes. She had spent 6 months studying Kivathi cadets, learning their tells, memorizing their unconscious movements. She knew that Keth's pupils dilated slightly before he fired. She knew that his trigger arm tensed exactly 200 milliseconds before discharge. She knew that he always exhaled at the moment of firing, because it helped stabilize his aim. She did not need to react to his shot. She only needed to predict. Then Keth opened fire in a continuous stream of plasma bolts, each one bright enough to blind, each one hot enough to vaporize flesh and bone. Alara moved like smoke. Her staff danced in patterns that seemed to defy physics, meeting bolt after bolt at impossible angles, redirecting them into the floor and walls and ceiling of the arena. She was not dodging, she was conducting, turning his attack into a symphony of deflected fire. The crowd had stopped murmuring. They were completely silent, watching something that should not be possible. Keth's lance began to overheat. Warning lights flickered across its surface, and the characteristic whine of an overworked cooling system filled the arena. But he did not stop firing, because he could not believe what was happening. He could not accept that a human with a stick was making him look Like a fool, his form broke, his shots grew wild and desperate. His lance began to glow red with heat, and Alara saw her. Opening, she stopped deflecting and started moving. Forward, 3 strides carried her across the distance between them, her staff spinning to knock aside the last few bolts. And then she was inside his guard where the lance was useless. Strike 1. Her staff cracked against his wrist, and his claws spasmed open, and the plasma lance clattered to the arena floor. Strike 2. She swept his knee and he buckled, his massive body suddenly unbalanced. Strike 3. The tip of her staff hovered at his throat, pressing just hard enough against his scales to make her point. The arena was absolutely silent. Keth looked up at her from his knees, his golden eyes wide with shock and something that might have been wonder. Yield, Alara said quietly. I yield, he replied, and there was no shame in his voice, only honest defeat. She stepped back and lowered her staff. The silence stretched for 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, and then the crowd erupted. The sound that filled the arena was not cheering exactly, but it was not mockery either. It was the sound of thousands of beings realizing that everything they believed about humans had been wrong. Alara stood in the center of the arena and let the sound wash over her. She looked up at the viewing box where Vartesh sat with his face twisted in fury. She looked at Commandant Sarath, whose ancient eyes gleamed with something that might have been satisfaction. She looked at the holographic projectors that were carrying her image to 100 worlds, including Earth, and then she reached down and offered her hand to Keth. He stared at it for a moment before accepting, and she helped him rise to his feet. How? He asked simply. I told you, she replied. Everything has weak points, and warriors are predictable if you study them long enough. She retrieved his plasma lance from the arena floor and handed it back to him. You are a good fighter, Keth, she said, but you rely on your weapon instead of understanding it. So learn the difference, and no one will ever defeat you again. He took the lance and looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. Thank you, he said. Quietly, Ella nodded and turned and walked out of the arena behind her. The crowd continued to roar. The emergency session of the Academy's Governing Council began 3 hours after the duel ended. Weapons Master Vortesh stood before the assembled instructors and demanded justice. The human made a mockery of our traditions, he declared, his scarred face twisted with rage. She humiliated a superior warrior with trickery and deception, and she must be expelled immediately. The other instructors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Many of them had watched the duel. Many of them had seen something they could not explain. Commandant Sarath sat at the head of the council table and let Vertesh speak without interruption. When the weapons master finally ran out of words, Sarath raised one hand and the room fell silent. Tell me, Vartesh, the commandant said in a voice like wind through ancient stones. What rule did Cadet Vance break? She could not possibly have deflected plasma bolts with a wooden stick unless she cheated somehow. That is not a rule. That is your disbelief. Vartesh's remaining eye narrowed. The human used a primitive weapon in a formal duel. The Academy Charter permits traditional cultural weapons, as you yourself acknowledged when you gave her that staff. She must have sabotaged Keth's lance somehow. Our technicians have examined the lance and found no evidence of tampering. Sarath leaned forward and fixed Vartesh with a gaze that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. The human followed every rule of the duel, the commandant said quietly. She simply followed them better than anyone expected. Vartesh opened his mouth to protest, but Sarath continued speaking. You gave her that stick because you wanted to humiliate her, because you believed humans were inferior and you wanted to prove it. But instead, she took your insult and turned it into victory. The commandant rose from the table. There will be no expulsion. and there will be no further discussion of this matter in council. Sareth turned to address the other instructors. However, I believe this incident has revealed something important that we have forgotten. The ancient being moved to the window and looked out at the academy grounds, where thousands of cadets trained with the most advanced weapons in the galaxy. We have become dependent on technology. Sareth said, "We give our young warriors plasma lances and harmonic disruptors and graviton hammers. And we tell them these tools will make them powerful. But we never teach them what to do when the tools fail." The commandant turned back to face the council. The human survived because she understood something fundamental. Weapons do not make warriors. Warriors make weapons. Sareth's eyes found Vertesh. You gave her a stick and she became dangerous with it. And that should tell us everything we need to know about what we have been doing wrong. The commandant announced a full assembly for the following day. Every cadet, instructor, and official at the academy gathered in the great hall where Alara had first received her wooden staff. The walls still glowed with the names of 10,000 heroes. But now there was space for new names to be added. Commandant Sareth stood at the center of the hall and addressed the crowd. "You have all heard what happened in the arena yesterday," Sareth began. "Many of you witnessed it yourselves, and I suspect many of you are still trying to understand what you saw." The commandant gestured, and Alara walked forward from the crowd to stand beside the ancient being. She carried her oak staff, now worn smooth by months of training, stained dark with drone lubricant and sweat. This cadet was given a stick when others received the finest weapons in the galaxy. Sareth continued. She was mocked and ignored and expected to fail. And instead she excelled beyond any reasonable expectation. The commandant turned to face Alara directly. "Cadet Vance, I have a question for you." Alara met the ancient eyes without flinching. "What do you call that weapon?" Sareth Alara considered the question. Carefully, she thought about the Filipino warriors who had fought. Colonizers with nothing but rattan sticks, she thought. About the Japanese monks who had developed bajutsu because they were forbidden to carry swords, she thought. About the Irish farmers who had turned walking sticks into weapons when oppressors took everything else. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her to fight in their small backyard on Earth, who had made her practice the same movements 10,000 times until they became part of her bones. On Earth, we have many names for it. She finally said, "Jo in Japanese, Bay in some traditions, quarterstaff in English, shillelagh in Irish." She paused and gripped the staff more tightly, but my grandmother called it something simpler. What? An equalizer. The word hung in the air of the great hall. She told me that humans invented stick fighting because we had no claws or fangs or armor. Alara continued, "We were soft and weak, and everything in the universe could kill us. So we found sticks and we made them into extensions of ourselves. And we became dangerous anyway." She looked out at the assembled cadets, at the Kavathi and Shen and Torvan and dozens of other species. "A plasma lance is a magnificent weapon," she said. "So is a harmonic disruptor, and so is a graviton hammer. But all of these weapons can fail, and when they fail, you need to know how to fight without them." She raised her staff. "This cannot fail," she said simply. "It is wood, and wood does what I tell it to do, and it will never run out of power or overheat or malfunction. And when everything else fails, this will still work." Commandant Sareth nodded slowly. "Beginning next term, the Academy curriculum will include mandatory training in simple melee weapons," the ancient being announced. "Every cadet, regardless of species or natural advantages, will learn to fight without technology before they are permitted to use advanced weapons." A murmur ran through the crowd. "This new doctrine will be called the Vance Curriculum," Sareth continued, in honor of the cadet who reminded us what we had forgotten. The murmur became something louder, something that might have been Apravalworth, stood at the edge of the crowd with his scarred face unreadable after. A long moment he turned and walked away without speaking 50 years later. Admiral Elara Vance stood on the bridge of the Coalition flagship, Persistence, and watched the star stream past the viewport, sir. Hair was gray now, and her face was lined with decades of service. But her hands were still strong, and her eyes were still sharp. The oak staff hung on the wall of her quarters, preserved behind glass, its surface worn almost white by years of use before she had finally retired. Ida. Young officer approached her with a question in his eyes. "Admiral," he said, "I have always wondered something. Ask, why did you never replace the staff with something more advanced? With a vibroblade or a force pike or any of the weapons available to someone of your rank?" Elara smiled the same smile she had worn in the arena 50 years ago. "That staff has killed 3 assassination attempts," she said. "It won 17 formal duels and outlasted 4 plasma rifles. And it saved my life more times than I can count." She turned to look at the young officer directly. "Why would I trade?" Down. The officer considered this for a moment. "The Vance Doctrine saved my life during the Kethris offensive," he said quietly. "When my rifle jammed, I remembered my training, and I survived because of it." "Good," Elara replied. "That is why we teach it." She turned back to the village. Stars. Somewhere out there, new cadets were learning to fight with simple weapons before they touched advanced technology somewhere. Out there, the lesson she had taught was being passed down to another generation. Weapons do not make warriors. Warriors make weapons, and a human with a fight stick can change the galaxy. The end.